Today we're going to be finishing off the large diorama that I mentioned in the video a few weeks ago. Obviously we've built parts of this already, but now we're going to be bringing it together in its large, final and heavy conclusion. And to do that we are going to need to build some structural elements of the base itself, but we also need to paint up a piranha. We are painting up this piranha in a similar way to the battlesuit from a few weeks ago, but we are going to be tackling it in a slightly different way. We are going to be starting from a black to white zenithal prime, which allows us to then thin down a bright medium blue and apply this across all of the ship's panels. We are going to be hitting all of the panels in one go, using a large brush and a couple of thinned coats until we have a nice smooth blue base. Then we can tie in all of our shadow tones. And we're going to start that off by applying a thin coat of a dark blue contrast over all of the panels we've just painted, giving us a nice darker tone with both of those blue hues present. Naturally, we will want to make this slightly brighter, so we can start that off by coming in and applying some overall brightness through a light blue that we used earlier, this time applied through an overall light dry brush across all of the surfaces. There was a couple of sections of footage for this project which I unfortunately lost. There was some of the original structure build as well as the additions that you've probably noticed that we've made to our piranha. However, I don't want to just leave you hanging, so we are going to be covering over a brief description of how we achieved that. Now, first off, the Tau people are not within the ship itself. They've been taken and they're actually used in another project that is part of this one. That being said, because there is no Tau in there, that means that we can have a more sleek and specific design. In order to make this, we're going to need some thin plastic card that is transparent. And it needs to be thin enough and flexible enough that we can bend it, shape it and cut it as needed. But before we get to the shaping and the cutting, we need to have a template. And in order to do that, the easiest thing to do is get some cling film plastic wrap or clear plastic sheeting that is thin and bendable and malleable that we can then drape over our canopy. Then with a large broad black pen, we can trace around the edge of our canopy onto that plastic sheeting. We can then take this plastic wrap and lay our clear plastic on top of it. Because our canopy is clear plastic, we can then see our previous markings. This means that we can take a pen and draw a replication of the canopy shape onto our plastic. When we do this, we want to try and make sure we use a relatively broad pen. What this will enable us to do is cut around the broad edge of the pen. One, seeing it easier, but also giving us a little bit of excess on all of the edges. This means that what we can do is use that excess to mount the canopy firmly in place. What we need to do is take the plastic sheeting, come in from the back end or behind the canopy, so underneath, push it through so that it's in roughly the right position and shape, and then we can tack it into place with something like super glue or blue tack. Once we've got everything tacked into place, then what we need to do is properly secure it, make sure it is fixed permanently in place. I found the easiest way to do this is to reinforce the internal joints with some UV resin. Just pour this into the cracks and the edges, making some cross hatching across the internal area. Cure this with UV, and that gives a nice, strong, rigid bond. We can then obviously follow up with things like milliput and anything like that if we want. Once we've made sure that the plastic is held securely in place and isn't going to come loose or shift, that's when we can come back and target the top end of the canopy. And we're going to be taking some milliput because it is dilutable, thinnable with water, as well as being sandable and fileable once it's dry. We can take that milliput and then essentially push it into all of the recesses and gaps around the canopy holes where we've pushed the plastic through, meaning that we then end up with a nice, smooth, consistent, sleek design from the front of the ship to the back with a consistent canopy line, which is nice and smooth. With all of that covered off, we can then jump back to the piranha where we want to build up some of the shadows. We're going to be following up the recent dry brush by taking a dilute dark blue contrast, but this time we are going to be applying it in a more careful and precise manner. Using a thinner brush, we can apply multiple thin passes, pulling from the brightest areas into the shadows with each pass and application. From there, it's just a case of a little bit of back and forth. Having a ready pot of each of our colours thinned down, both a pot of bright and dark blue, means that we can quickly jump back and forth, blending across the model between those dark blue shadows and those bright blue highlights. Just remember that when we are applying our highlights, we want to pull our light blue towards those edges and the bright spots, while when we're using our dark blue shadow, we want to be pulling this towards the recesses and shadowy areas. We can build up our highlights and our shadows over 5 or 6 passes, and naturally we can build highlights and create them in any particular way that we want. Here, what I'm doing is trying to create a scratchy, cascading, chaotic sort of effect with all of our highlights, which is why we're going in and doing thinner, strokier highlights nearer the edges, and then giving more of a harmonious blend with our shadows. With that all said, that covers the blues off once we've blended between the shadows and the highlights, and we can jump into the other elements. The accent panels on the Piranha are going to be in a bluish black tone. For this, we are going to be using contrast. But obviously, all of our panels are blue and not in a zenithal. But we're actually going to cover the chosen blue panels in our dark blackish blue contrast. Rather than going over pure, what we're going to do is slightly dilute this and then apply a couple of coats of this contrast in a couple of passes. This will darken down those areas, but on some of the sharpest and most prominent edges, there will be some of that blue base coat showing through. We can then take our light blue from the armor panels and mix this in slightly to our dark black blue contrast, and then use this to essentially trace out all of those blue areas showing through, which we can essentially use as a map for our highlights. Then, similar to the blue, we want to reshade all of this, and we're going to be doing that by taking our thinned black blue contrast and then applying this where all of the transitions are. Similar to when painting the blue panels, we are going to be pulling this contrast glaze into the shadows, giving us a nice quick transition on those smaller chosen sections. Then we need to swap to a pure dark black contrast, and we're going to use this to block out all of the areas that we're going to want to paint as metal. On the Piranha, this is essentially the engines, the guns, as well as a couple other small areas. But we are not going to be painting the metals yet. We can do them near enough last. Now, we're going to be starting on some of the red accents, and this is going to be the panels, but as well, it's going to be the canopy. And I want to try and make the canopy come across as something like there is lights on the inside that's emitting through, or it's some sort of electromagnetic field which is used as a canopy instead. However, in order to do this, I want to try and make a sort of spotty, stabby sort of effect. And the easiest way I know how to do that is to essentially use a template. And for a template, I'm going to be using some wire mesh. To do this, we want to form our metal mesh around the canopy, trying to make sure that it's not going to shift or move. Here, we're using some masking putty in order to hold everything in place before we find a long, soft bristle brush, press it into some white paint, and then come back to apply that to the mesh. This should hopefully only pass through where the holes in the mesh are, giving us a nice spotty dotty pattern. This means we are essentially set for a red contrast. We can take a really bright red contrast and glaze this over all of the canopy, giving us that really nice bright pop of intense colour. This canopy will be brighter than the other panels which we're going to be painting red, and those we are going to be picking out using a medium to dark burgundy before we come back once that's dry with the thinned bright red contrast, and then use this to glaze in some brightness into the areas of the panels. This will essentially result in our canopy being a very similar colour to our panels, except that our canopy is going to be a lot brighter, and that kind of makes a lot of sense. Obviously, our panels are just material, metal, or whatever composite the Tau happen to use, while the canopy is either a glass canopy, at which point we've got the lights from inside that area shining through, or it's potentially with the Tau some sort of digital force field as a canopy, at which point what you can see is the force field reacting with all of the elements around it. Either way, in either of those situations, the canopy would naturally be brighter because it's generating and emitting some form of light. And hopefully we've been able to capture that effect in the way that we've painted both of these elements. Now that really does only leave the metals. And for this, I've decided to expand my range of metals again. We've gone for the Fanatic Metallic range, and this comes with a lot of really nice various metals. And hang on, what else is in here? Oh, it's the subscribe button. For our metals, we are going to be leaning two ways in order to give a bit of variation, but we're going to be starting from the same place, which is a dark, cool bronze, which is going to be applied across all of the metal areas, regardless of our chosen final colour. A couple of coats later, we should have a nice base, which we can start to build on. Anything gold will get a few thin, quick layers of a mid-gold before being finished off with a quick round of edge highlights using a bright gold. Then, for any of the remaining areas, we're going down the silver route, and what we're going to do is mix in some silver into our cool bronze, and then use this in order to highlight all of the silver accents, before we come in and highlight all of the areas with just a brighter silver, this too mixed into a little bit of our last colour, which will give us a nice blend of the colours from silver to gold. What we're then going to do is tone this down because it might be a little bit too bright, and in order to do that we're going to thin down a brown contrast, apply this over all of the metals, which will nicely harmonise them as well as give some recess shading. This brown wash should nicely recess shade and harmonise all of our metals, essentially finishing off our Piranha. We are not painting the drones for the Piranha, for the simple fact of we only need 2 drones for our project and we painted them with the battlesuit. So we are essentially good. And now we're going to be moving on to one of those elements that I mentioned earlier, where unfortunately I have corrupted footage. So I can't show you exactly what happened, but I will kind of paint you a nice picture with words. However, this is essentially the last opportunity to take a guess at what other videos are part of this project series, as well as what you think the final outcome is going to be. If you want, you can just carry on watching and then make your guess at the end and just lie, but you'll know, and that's not cool. But you could guess now and then go back and edit your comment and let us know how you get on. Either way, let's jump into the structural build. Our diorama is actually going to be mounted in one of these style vivarium fish tanks that you may have seen in stores for lizards or maybe even a goldfish. And that's what we're going to be using to contain everything. What we're going to be containing is actually a structure made from XPS foam. Unfortunately, I don't have the footage of how we made it. So essentially, in a brief description, we cut XPS foam using a foam cutter to the correct size based on our plan. So whatever things we were adding into it, we made sure that it was the correct size. Then I glued it all together, and the thing that I chose to use is No More Nails, which I find is a nice strong tacky bond and dries quite quickly. Once all of that was stuck together, we can essentially encase it all and give it a nice strong structure, which we can just make out of various different adhesives, glues, and things like that. With our structure blocks fixed and dried, we can turn to shifting this into a clipped face. Taking our No More Nails and a few sheets of cork bark, we can work across the face of our structure, building out a textured front layer of cork, which will act as our mounting. Once we have worked up and down the front, applying various areas of cork, we then want to start to lock all of this in place, which we're going to be doing with a large, liberal amount of super glue spread across all of the surfaces and trying to target the joints of the bark that we've placed down. We can then come in and sprinkle some sand all over the top surface nice and quickly to soak up any of the excess, as well as add a little bit more texture to our rock. We then need to let this fully dry before we come back with some form of texture paste or filler, and then use this to come in and fill any gaps. Using this similar to mortar, we can push it into anywhere where we need to help firm up the joints or make a consistent rock face. Finally, we can mask all of that work that we've just done and all of the various elements by once again liberally applying some more super glue across all of the surface of our mountain and cliff front, and then again sprinkle some dirt, debris and small rocks over the top to give us a nice mixed textured surface. I tend to find that this is actually a really quick and easy way to make a natural looking large section of rock surface. Obviously, it's worth pointing out that we have a little layer of protection between the foam and the massive amount of superglue that we applied in the last step. You will have noticed that the foam that we are using seems to have a semi-soft, solid green shell, and essentially that was made up from a mixture of clear PVA, no more nails, as well as green paint. Mixed together really well, giving us a gel type strong sealing liquid. That was then applied over all of the XPS foam, which not only sealed that whole unit together, but also gives us a nice strong barrier that we can then stick all of our superglue to, so we don't end up with lots of smoking and dissolving XPS, which can happen when you either spray it or naturally apply superglue. Taking our cliff face out to be sprayed, we applied a 3-tiered zenithal. First, we applied a heavy black spray, making sure to catch all of the details and the shadows. Then we did a medium brown spray, and that was to catch most of the surfaces, leaving the black in the recesses. Then we followed it up with a light white spray in order to catch the most prominent and sharpest edges, setting us up nicely for the next steps, which is going to be to apply various washes. First, we want to apply an overall red-brown wash, which will give us a relatively universal tone for our rock face. While this is wet, what we then want to do is grab a few bottles of various different colours and drop these directly onto the rocks in random places. We picked out a selection of 4 or 5 colours and tones, including black, red, purple and blue. Once applied, these will spread out and seep into various areas and patterns, applying some variation across the rocks. This naturally will need to dry out fully, but once it has, we can grab an ivory and then lightly dry brush this across all of the rocks, bringing back a lot of that surface texture and detail that we lost by applying so many dark wash applications. Now, we're mounting part of this diorama and essentially this cliff face into a plastic clear tank, as I may have mentioned earlier. However, as you'll see, we've only actually done one side of the cliff face, the other side has a hole in it, and the 2 sides are just blank. And that's fine, because we're going to be putting it in the tank, and we're going to be essentially blacking out the panels of the tank so that you can't see those areas. So let's quickly do that so that we've got a rough guide of placement, and then we can start to build the rest of the scene. We need to first apply some masking, take it out to be sprayed in our chosen colour, and then, once it's dry, come back and peel off all of that masking work. We then have a rough placement for our ground, where we will be building a floor surface on the ground where the cliff is. Now we know where our cliff is because we have the black areas. We can use this as a guide and apply any basing material to the clear plastic areas that remain. Here we are going to be using some structure gel in order to get some wet looking muddy sandy floor. Naturally, all of this dirt that we've applied, we can't go out and spray it with a black spray, a white spray or a brown spray. We're going to have to do all of this work by brush, and I did that simply by applying washes with a brush very carefully, avoiding all of the clear plastic because we want to try and keep that as crystal clear as possible. Now, you've essentially hit the point where, unfortunately, if you wanted to guess at what projects are involved in this big diorama, as well as what the diorama is, you've kind of run out of time because I'm going to be telling you half of that information now. Naturally, as you know, we've got the Piranha in this video, as well as the broadside in the last video in this series. However, the other 2 projects that were kind of hidden, but you may have been able to piece together, is also our Tau lab, where we see some Tau soldiers doing a little bit of an operation on a Kazakin, as well as our Kazakin base diorama. We're going to be using all of those and combining them into a larger, bigger, massive diorama. We then need to take all of these elements and start putting them together. And to be honest, this is not the best filming angle. It's a little bit big for my general filming setup, but we did our best, don't worry. And what we had to start off with is first the lab, which needed to be pushed into a small pocket in the back rear, as well as having some lights installed. And these had to be mounted from the outside coming inside. And then we had to naturally appropriately seal off that hole so that we don't get any issues later on. What we're going to be doing first is making a small hole in the bottom of the tank, which is going to allow us to feed a small set of string lights up through the side of the tank and then into our lab area. We stole this from a small Christmas decoration earlier in the year, and we're going to be sealing these in and diffusing these lights by pushing them under a translucent plastic sheet. This sheet, as well as the lights themselves, are going to be held in place by the friction of the lab, which is the Tau operating theatre. This just so happens to be the exact correct size we need to be able to push it into the gap. It is a tight fit, but once it's in place, the lab and the lights are fixed, allowing us to mount the block and try to make sure that this is watertight. When mounting this mounting into this essential tank, we are going to be liberally applying waterproof sealant across all of the sides and the bottom, hopefully sealing the lab away from the cliffside entirely. Once our base structure is mounted and had time to dry, we can tackle the blending and merging of details. We can also use this time to add a little bit of colour or variety to our sea floor. Yes, a sea floor. We are actually making a resin, two-part resin diorama where we're going to be having a landmass and a large section of sea. And this is a very deep pour for what I'm used to. But in order to achieve this, we actually needed to make a few adjustments and amendments to things like our piranha. My goal is to have the battle suit on the ground and the piranha halfway up in the tank. And in order to do that, we need to find an effective way to mount the piranha halfway up the tank. To help sell the positioning and feeling of movement, we did two things. First, we got hold of some flame effects from Green Stuff World, but rather than using them as weapon effects, we can turn them round and stick them into the jets of the piranha, painting them in a grey-white to give us that intense bubble effect feeling. The other thing that we could do is mount the model onto a clear plastic rod, which was easy to do with some super glue. We then have the ship on a plastic rod, and we can mount this in place, taking a little bit of super glue, applying the rod to the base, following it up by gluing the battle suit into the tank as well, meaning that we have a nice positioning with the battle suit at the front, with the piranha bursting up through the center of the tank. I found it easier to hold the model in the correct place using some wire and then letting the rod glue dry overnight using a decent amount of super glue. I also chucked a little bit of sand debris into the bottom of the tank. This will stick to the super glue and hopefully slightly give us a wider, stronger bonding area, as well as adding a little bit of an extra element and texture in the water. And now comes the overall big part. We are going to be mixing up resin and then pouring it into our diorama, essentially covering our battle suit and mostly covering our piranha. So what could go wrong? What am I anticipating as potential problems? Well, there's kind of, I guess, two main issues that I can see. One, we've got the resin overheating, and that is essentially where it's a exothermic reaction. So as it reacts and starts to cure, it generates heat. The resin I'm using is a deep pour resin, but it's still only recommended for around 2 inches of depth. Whereas the tank we're going for is around 6 to 8 inches, give or take. So there is a chance that we may get some really, really horrendous bubbling if the whole thing starts to boil. The other thing that we've got is leaking, and this is a kind of two-stage problem, to be fair. We've got the initial leak, which is if it goes from the water section into the lab section, because the lab is technically meant to be in a hatch underground, not technically underwater. But also, if it gets into the lab, there's also the hole that we put in the tank with the lights, which means that all the resin may just come out. So those are the two main risks that I can see with the project. But we have got some mitigations, don't worry. Mitigation to problem number one, I have a fridge. I've done my research, I've done a little bit of YouTube foo, and seen how large bits of resin generally go terribly, terribly wrong. So I've tried to steal those ideas, and generally the common thing is put it in a fridge, cool it down before it starts to boil, and then you won't end up with boiling resin, which is where the bubbles come from. So I have a fridge. Mitigation to problem number 2, and you've probably seen what that was. We've applied a load of sealant, and we've also then sealed all of the edges around the rocks after the fact with various different texture pastes. So hopefully all of that is enough to stop the resin from going where it's meant to be into the bit where it's not meant to be. And we'll see. And finally, a third bonus mitigation to a problem I didn't tell you about. I haven't varnished any of these models in any way, shape or form. I have left them to dry for a good long time, some of them months. And essentially this is just a mitigation to things like colour bleeding from paints. In theory, it shouldn't be a problem. I haven't varnished them, but they should be cured. But I guess it's technically a risk. No real mitigation. The mitigation is time. So we'll see how that works out. The resin we are using is a 2-to-1 ratio. And in answer to the question you are thinking, 5.5 litres. That's how much resin we are planning to use for this project. And that means that we need a large bucket, which means that we can carefully pour our various resins together and then start mixing them carefully. Once we have thoroughly mixed them together for around 5 minutes, trying to not introduce as many or any bubbles into the mix, we can start to pour the contents of our resin into our tank, keeping an eye on it, popping any bubbles as they appear, and then planning to pop it in the fridge as the temperature starts to rise. Now, after being in the fridge overnight, the reaction had fully cooked off and everything had cured. And it's worth pointing out that we did actually have a leak into the lab. I noticed it before it went into the fridge, so we were able to top it up with some spare remaining resin because I was smart enough to account for potential failure. So we had some pre-made resin, we could just top that up. The downside is the lab is now completely full of resin. It doesn't really have any air bubbles, which is nice, so it could be perceived as being underground and not underwater. My hope is that the feeling and concept still reads, and it doesn't look like there's random towel in an underwater base operating on a human underwater, which doesn't make sense. My hope is that conceptually it pulls through. Now, for the more important bit, the large 7-inch area of resin, which is the area that it's not designed for. Well, you might as well just have a look. As we can see, there were some issues, mainly overheating leading to large bubbles. However, to be honest, most of these probably would have been workable, if not even thematic. We have a massive intense disturbance around where the ship is and where the ship jets are. And we also have smaller bubbles around the battlesuit. The issue is the entire backside of the project is essentially a large, dense, bubbly mess. However, we can persevere. We have essentially already locked around £100 worth of plastic painted models in this resin, so we might as well continue, but move into a little bit of crisis management. How can we rescue this though? That is the question. And as I said, most of the bubbles aren't too bad. It's mainly at the back of the scene. There is a massive intense set of bubbles. It's no longer clearly see-through. You can't see through it, and it's a bit of a mess. So we can steal an idea from aquariums and fish tanks and things like that. What we're going to do is remask up our tank, making sure that all of the nice clear areas and view lines that we do like are maintained, crystal clear and beautiful. And then we're going to paint a seascape in the background. Essentially, we're going to be priming the background blue, which will give us a nice watery effect and darken the overall colour of the resin, giving us that sea look, while also completely blocking the really, really horrible view angle, meaning that you can't see most of the horribleness. And I think this is just a lot easier and potentially less aesthetically harmful than going in with a large drill and trying to drill out various holes and filling them back in with resin. The advantage of this is that is still always possible. If I change my mind later, I can drill through and dig out those holes and fill them with resin. Let me know what you would have done. Do you think our approach is easier, better, worse, or what would you have done? With the biggest and the hardest parts done, now we can mount some of the final details. First, we have 2 drones. and these are actually going to be mounted floating above the water. And to do this, we're going to use clear plastic rods, the same as we did for our Piranha, only thinner. But we do need to coat the top of these models in some of the 2-part resin in order to make it look like they've come out of the water and water is pouring off. We can also improve and increase this effect by draping a very thin thread across the models while the resin is drying, and then also coating this in the resin, giving us a look of water drops spraying off from the model. From there, we simply need to mount our Kazakin base to the top of the tank using the same tricks as we've used through this entire video, merging any harsh elements by applying some texture paste, applying washes, dry brushes, and various blending in order to tie it all together. We can then top off the project by grabbing a large amount of off-the-shelf water paste and applying this to create a nice choppy sea surface. That then leaves you with this, a 7.5 kilogram block of resin that also happens to be a Warhammer 40k diorama. And naturally, there were issues with this. We had our intense bubbling, but we've tried to counteract it and solve any issues by removing unsightly sight lines, stealing a couple of aquarium tricks and things like that. I also like the fact that the lights still work in the lab, and hopefully the lab will still be perceived as underground and not underwater. Naturally, there are issues. My intention is to take this to a competition at the end of the month. I'm still going to be doing that. I am proud of the model and the outcome and the time that I spent making this, and I do want to take it and display it at the upcoming competition. So that is going to be happening. Obviously, we've got lessons learned. We've got things that we learned from this. Predominantly, I learned 2 main things. One, never trust sealant and potentially seal everything a little bit better. That's not my major concern though. What I think I should have done is when going through and dealing with the 2-part resin, I was monitoring it, popping any small bubbles as they appeared, and making sure that it got to the point of kicking and reacting before I put it into the fridge. I didn't want to kill the reaction too soon. In hindsight, I should have put it in a lot sooner. I didn't account for the fact that just putting it into the fridge, it's got to seep through the outer side to get to that middle bit where it's going to be the densest and hottest. And that, I think, is where the main issues came up. So what I probably should have done is just, once I'd poured it, checked that it wasn't leaking. When I found out it was leaking, refilled it, and then just stuck it in the fridge from that point and left it. And I think it still would have reacted, still would have cured, and then wouldn't have bubbled. But that is for a future video, for a future project. If this has inspired you, or do you know of anyone that's kind of done these in a tank diorama? Because I haven't seen them before. I've done another one similar to this before that did actually go very, very well and didn't involve any 2-part resin. But unfortunately, I don't have a video for that on this channel. That was pre-channel. But what I do have is, if you want to see the various elements that made up this whole diorama, you can check them out here. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.